I came to Whispering Pines to forget, not to remember. That's the cruel irony of it all. After 20 years of capturing humanity at its worst, wars, famines, riots, it was a schoolyard shooting in Brooklyn that finally broke me. I couldn't stop shaking for weeks. The doctor called it a nervous breakdown. My editor at the Times called it taking some personal time. I called it surrender. The cabin belonged to my uncle before he passed. Remote, rustic, the kind of place where silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's a presence all its own, the perfect retreat for a man whose mind had become a darkroom filled with negatives he couldn't bear to develop. I arrived in October 1956, when the trees surrounding Whispering Pines were ablaze with color. Fall had always been my favorite season to photograph, but I'd left my cameras back in New York. Dr. Levinson's orders. "Distance yourself from the tools of your trauma, Mr. Sullivan," he'd said. So instead of my trusty Leica, I brought books, bourbon, and enough sedatives to ensure dreamless sleep. The first few days passed in a haze. I'd wake late, read until my eyes blurred, take long walks through the woods, then drink myself to sleep. The locals largely left me alone, save for Mrs. Winters, who ran the general store, and would ask after my health when I stopped in for supplies. "Getting any better, Mr. Sullivan?" she'd ask, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. It was during my third week that I found it. I'd been searching the cabin's small attic for extra blankets. The nights were getting colder. When I knocked over an old fishing tackle box, the contents spilled across the wooden floorboards. Hooks, lines, and there, rolled tight and secured with a rubber band, a canister of undeveloped film. I should have left it alone, should have respected whatever forgotten memories my uncle had stored away. But curiosity is a journalist's disease, and I was still sick with it. The cabin had no darkroom, of course, but old habits die hard. I'd packed a changing bag, the kind photographers use to load film in the field, without even thinking about it. Some part of me must have known I'd eventually need it. That night, I drove into town to the hardware store and purchased the chemicals I'd need. The owner, a balding man named Jenkins, raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know you were a photographer, Sullivan." "Just a hobby," I replied, the lie coming easily. I turned the bathroom into a makeshift darkroom that night, hanging towels over the small window and working by the dim red glow of a flashlight covered with cellophane. The process was soothing, familiar. For the first time since arriving, my hands didn't shake as I mixed the developer and fixer. The negatives emerged slowly, like ghosts materializing in the chemical bath. 6 exposures in total. The first 2 were mundane landscapes of the lake, nothing remarkable. The third showed the town square, empty save for a single car I didn't recognize, something from the late 40s. The fourth negative stole my breath. A woman, mid-30s perhaps, lying face down beside the lake. The composition was poor, slightly tilted, as if taken in haste. A dark stain pooled beneath her head, spreading into the water's edge. The fifth, closer now, the woman's face visible, eyes open and empty. No mistake about what I was seeing. The sixth, a man standing over her, his back to the camera, something clutched in his right hand. The image was blurry, as if my uncle's hands had been shaking when he took it. I hung the negatives to dry, my mind racing. Had my uncle witnessed a murder? Documented it? Why hadn't he gone to the police? And why keep the film undeveloped all these years? Sleep wouldn't come that night. I paced the cabin floor until dawn, then made contact prints of the negatives as soon as the morning light was strong enough. Seeing them positive rather than negative only confirmed what I'd seen. This was a murder, clear as day. After breakfast, I drove into town, the prints carefully tucked into my jacket pocket. The sheriff's office was a small brick building just off Main Street. Inside, a young deputy sat at the front desk, engrossed in a paperback western. "I need to speak with the sheriff," I said. "It's important." The deputy, his nameplate read Williams, looked up with thinly veiled annoyance. "Sheriff Tanner's making his rounds. Won't be back till noon. Something I can help you with?" I hesitated, then decided against showing the prints to anyone but the sheriff. "I'll come back." I killed time at the diner across the street, nursing a cup of coffee that grew cold as I watched the clock. Shortly after noon, a police cruiser pulled up to the station. The man who stepped out was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples that matched the badge on his chest. Sheriff Tanner. This time, the deputy didn't stop me as I walked straight to the sheriff's office. Tanner looked up from his desk, assessing me with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail.
You must be Sullivan, staying out at the old Parker place.
I nodded, surprised he knew who I was. I found something I think you should see. I placed the prints on his desk. Tanner examined them one by one, his expression unchanging. When he finished, he looked up at me, brow furrowed not in concern but confusion. What exactly am I looking at here? A murder, I said. By the lake. I found the undeveloped film in my uncle's cabin. The sheriff picked up the most damning print, the close-up of the woman's face, and studied it again. This isn't a murder, Mr. Sullivan. There hasn't been a murder in Whispering Pines for over 30 years. Then what do you call that? I tapped the photograph. Looks to me like someone's art project. Or maybe shots from a local play. The drama club puts on murder mysteries every few years. He smiled, sliding the prints back toward me. Your uncle was probably involved. He used to help with set design, if I recall correctly. The dismissal was so complete, so confident, that for a moment I doubted myself. Had I misinterpreted what I'd seen? The shots didn't look staged, but my mind hadn't been reliable lately. I'm certain these are real, I insisted. The woman in the photo. Do you recognize her? Tanner sighed, the kind of sigh adults reserve for troublesome children. Mr. Sullivan, I understand you've been through a difficult time. Your editor called ahead, mentioned you needed rest. Why don't you take these, he gestured at the prints, and put them away. Focus on getting better. My editor had called? I hadn't told anyone where I was going except Dr. Levinson. Something cold settled in my stomach. Thank you for your time, I said stiffly, gathering the prints. Back in my car, anger replaced confusion. I knew what I'd seen, and if the sheriff wouldn't look into it, I would. 20 years as an investigative photojournalist had taught me how to dig for truth, even when others tried to bury it. I spent the afternoon at the town library, searching through back issues of the local paper. If there had been a murder, there would be a record of it, the librarian. A severe woman named Miss Phelps watched me with narrowed eyes as I requested archives from 1945 through 1955. Hours of searching yielded nothing. No reports of missing women, no mysterious deaths, no bodies found by the lake. I was about to give up when I noticed a small article from September 1953, tucked away on page 6. Local woman leaves town unexpectedly. The piece mentioned a Margaret Holloway, a widow who had departed Whispering Pines without farewells, leaving neighbors surprised by her sudden absence. There was no photograph, but the description, dark-haired, slender, in her mid-30s, matched the woman in the negatives. Further down, the article noted that Sheriff Tanner had assured concerned citizens that Mrs. Holloway had left a note indicating she was moving to Chicago to live with relatives. I copied down the details, then asked Miss Phelps if she remembered Margaret Holloway. Of course, she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty library. Lovely woman. Taught piano to half the children in town, including mine. We were all shocked when she left so suddenly. Did she have family in Chicago? Miss Phelps frowned. Not that I recall. Her people were from Boston originally. I thanked her and left, my mind racing. A woman with supposedly no family in Chicago suddenly leaves town. No one sees her go. The sheriff assures everyone it's normal, and my uncle, who apparently never took photographs, happens to have captured what looks like her murder. That evening, I returned to the lake, prints in hand. I wanted to find the exact spot where the body had been photographed. The shoreline was extensive, but certain landmarks in the background, a distinctive birch tree, an outcropping of rocks, helped me narrow it down. As dusk fell, I found it. The same view as in the photographs, though the seasons had changed. I stood there, trying to imagine what had happened. Had my uncle been a witness, an accomplice? Or had he stumbled upon the scene after the fact? Beautiful spot, isn't it? I nearly jumped out of my skin. Sheriff Tanner stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching me with those pale eyes. Just taking a walk, I said, quickly pocketing the prints. Funny place to walk. Most folks stick to the trails. He gestured toward the forest path I'd ignored. This part of the shoreline gets pretty muddy, easy to lose your footing. The threat wasn't subtle. I'll be careful, I replied. Tanner nodded. See that you are. Wouldn't want another accident out here. He left me standing there, the word another echoing in my head.